crisis occurs...
Are you recording all this?
Is that okay?
Of course. Well, what's the point of my telling you if I'm not recording?
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Tumultuous times you've gone through, your whole life has been one of bringing peace to the world. It's the only, I can't describe it any other way. The idealism that I guess brought you and Mr. Kennedy together. I think that was probably what he saw in you and what you saw in him was that spark of idealism.
I think you were absolutely right there. And not too many have discerned to that, but I think that's exactly right.
June 10, 1963. It's what we call the peace speech, and I think it was JFK's best speech, better than his inaugural or any others, because he was talking about we had to resolve differences, including Western differences with the Soviet Union, and just resolving differences worldwide without resorting to war and violence. To minimize differences, he said that in the final analysis, we all inhabit the same planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal.
For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
I had a hand in almost all his major speeches for 10 or 11 years that I worked with him.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
All this will not be finished in the first 100 days, nor will it be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor even perhaps in our lifetime on this planet. But let us begin.
How did you come to meet Senator Kennedy as he was in those days?
Just luck. He had just been elected to the Senate. He didn't have a staff yet. I was in Washington working for a congressional committee that expired, and the chairman of that committee, wonderful economist from the University of Chicago named Senator Paul Douglas of Illinois, recommended me to Kennedy. Kennedy was elected in November '52, and he interviewed me for just a few minutes in January 1953. And at the same time, I had an offer from another Democratic senator, and I had a hard time deciding which one to pick. After those first offers came in, I had a couple of senior mentors in Washington. They both said I should go with the other senator, Henry Scoop Jackson from the state of Washington, that he was more progressive, he had a better future. Kennedy was likely to be too close to his conservative father. But because in that first 5-minute meeting I had gained an impression of Kennedy that I liked, he was not showing off his millionaire background or his war hero status, or even the fact that he had a Harvard education compared to my University of Nebraska. I thought he was a good guy, an ordinary guy, and so I went back to see Kennedy, and he told me he needed somebody to help him prepare or legislation that would revive the New England economy, which was pretty sick at that point. I went to see Jackson, asked him what he wanted me for, and he said that Senator Douglas had told him I was one of the smartest lawyers he knew, and he said, I need somebody like that to get my name in the papers. Didn't take a lot of genius to figure out which of those two was better.
Do you draw parallels between the anti-Catholic movement that was against Kennedy and the anti-African-American movement that's against Obama?
Yes, if anything, it was stronger against Kennedy because people thought that the Catholics exercised mind control and that a Catholic president would therefore be submissive to the Pope, that he would permit clergymen to tell their parishioners how to vote. They don't mind if Protestant ministers tell their congregations how to vote, but in those days, the fear of a Catholic in the White House, which today seems incomprehensible, nobody thinks about it, was very, very strong, and that is one of the reasons why I thought Obama could win in 2008 if a Catholic could win in 1960. And so they both faced formidable demographic obstacles, but both were young, both were articulate and eloquent, both had a good idea of how the United States looked from abroad because both of them had spent time abroad. Obama when he was growing up, Kennedy when he was an ambassador's son. So I think Obama is more like John F. Kennedy than any president since.
I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute. But contrary to common newspaper usage, I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens also to be a Catholic.
I'm an idealist and was raised by two idealistic parents, and Kennedy, in his way, was an idealist, as that American University address clearly showed.
What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.
A crisis occurs. What is the first thing that goes through your head?
Number one, pick the right team to advise you. People whose judgment you want, whose recommendations you want and can trust. Not necessarily because of their title or their rank, and certainly not because of their charm. No, it's people who have judgment. Judgment is the absolute key ingredient in the White House. Second, what allies do I have? Do I tell my allies? Do I bring them in? The Bush team would say, no, we don't want allies. They're backseat drivers. It's a big, complicated world. I want allies. I want whatever advice and experience they can draw upon. Number three, crisis usually means an adversary. Do I talk with my adversary or do I hit him? Do I communicate with him or do I ignore him? I'm in favor of if you can find the path, communicate, negotiate, find an answer. Almost everybody has some ground that he would like as a compromise. Mm-hmm. Well, those are the first things that come to my mind. And I'm sure there is. Timing is also important. Once you get the team together, when do you act? And don't act too soon, but don't act too late.
So let us begin anew, remembering on both sides that civility is not a sign of weakness, and sincerity is always subject to proof. Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate.
Pretty sad story. When Kennedy took office, January 20, 1961, he learned that the CIA and military chiefs that he had inherited from his predecessor, a pretty good fellow, General Eisenhower, had been president before, he had inherited a plan to throw out Castro as the head of Cuba by sending into Cuba an invasion of Cuban exiles, men who had been recruited, trained, armed by the CIA, and then transported to Cuba to a landing site called the Bay of Pigs. Well, Kennedy kicked himself afterwards for believing all he had been told, that it would be a success, that the people of Cuba, as soon as they heard about the landing, would rise up and throw Castro out, forgetting or ignoring the fact that most of the anti-Castro people by that time were either in Miami or in jail. Word of this plot was widely leaked by the anti-Castro community in Florida, and Castro was ready for the invasion. He had his army many, many times larger than this band of exiles waiting for them at the Bay of Pigs, and it was a one-sided fiasco, and everything the CIA had told Kennedy, that victory was sure, that no one would know that the United States was involved, all that turned out to be completely false.
First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view.
Everybody says Kennedy didn't supply the air support and therefore the invasion was doomed because of that. What made him step back and say, whoa, wait a second
Number
now.
one, he realized once it was underway, and he found out that every single premise on which that plan had been sold to him was false, and he thought air support is just getting the U.S. in deeper, and the exiles had already been vanquished at the Bay of Pigs, and there was no way to reverse that through air support, but it was a sure way of inducing the Soviet Union to come in with its nuclear weapons. He wasn't going to dig a hole deeper once he found himself in that hole.
Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again.
Did Kennedy trust the CIA?
Not after the Bay of Pigs.
I know he brought McCone in.
Yes. Who was very conservative, but truthful, straight as an arrow, and very solid in preventing rogue agents running off with the family jewelry.
There was something very alarming in your book as well, sir, as I read it. The CIA, just prior to the launch of the Bay of Pigs, had done its own study of whether the plan would succeed or not, and they came to the conclusion that it wouldn't succeed, but they never told JFK that.
That's right. That was only long, long afterwards that we heard about that study.
What do you think they were trying to do? Were they trying to manipulate him somehow?
Who knows? The CIA was testing the new president, I suppose, wanted to prove to him how tough they were. Cuba was not a threat to the United States, but it was an irritant, and I suppose they wanted to show Kennedy they had an answer to this irritant. They weren't going to send American troops. They were just going to let Cuban exiles who wanted to reinvade and reconquer their own country, let them go ahead. It may have sounded good to them on paper, but it was foolish from the beginning to think that this little band of exiles could defeat Castro's army.
Many people speculate about the Bay of Pigs that they were trying to draw the United States into an all-out war against Cuba. Do you feel that?
I think the Cuban exiles were. Not so sure the CIA was, although the CIA was so confident of victory, they might have been. But yes, the Cuban exiles thought that they could go back and take over the government, take over the country, get back their land that Castro had taken from them, get back their business enterprises that Castro had taken from them, and they wanted Kennedy to be drawn into a war that the United States would win, forgetting that Cuba was backed by the other nuclear power, the Soviet Union, and it would have been crazy for Kennedy to start a war with the Soviet Union's ally, Cuba.
Kennedy was anti-war because of his experiences.
That's right.
In the American University address, when he says, the world knows America will never start a war, of course they don't know that now. But then his next sentence was, this generation of Americans has seen enough of war. He meant himself. He'd seen enough of war.
The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression. We must labor on, not towards a strategy of annihilation, but towards a strategy of peace.
He had been in war and injured. Two of his best friends on his boat were killed. His older brother had been killed in the European theater earlier, was not going to start a world war over Cuba or anything else.
Tuesday, October 16th, 1962. Can you take us through that momentous beginning of that crisis?
I certainly can, because it's still as vivid in my mind as if it had happened yesterday. The Cuban Missile Crisis that historians still call the most dangerous 13 days in the history of mankind. The President called me in that morning, Tuesday, October 16. He told me that, to his astonishment and anger, because we'd all been lied to about it, Khrushchev had a back channel means of corresponding with Kennedy. He lied about what he was doing in Cuba. The Soviet ambassador, not a bad fellow, Anatoly Dobrynin, called both Bobby and me in on separate occasions to lie to us about what was going on in Cuba. And Kennedy said that these U-2 airplanes taking pictures 50,000 feet above Cuba, and it showed it was the beginnings, just the beginnings, but unmistakably the beginnings of Soviet missile sites, missiles that carried nuclear payloads and had a range capable of devastating almost any part of the United States and most parts of the Western Hemisphere, which includes Canada. And he said he was calling a meeting for later that morning. He wasn't calling a meeting at the National Security Council, because that particular body is fixed by statute. A lot of people, because of their job, are invited to National Security Council meetings, and Kennedy didn't want all those people. Some of them he didn't think had the kind of judgment and brains that he wanted to give him a recommendation, and some of them he thought couldn't keep a secret all that well, especially if they all brought their deputies with them, which sometimes people do to show how important they are in Washington. And you get a room full of people, and it's almost impossible, A, to get the kind of crisp, precise decision that Kennedy liked to make, and B, to keep a secret. And he did not want everybody in Washington to know about this, because then the Soviets, as he put it, would know that we know, and then they might take some preemptive action. They might use the missiles, or they might send Khrushchev to the United Nations meeting in New York at that time and have him try a little nuclear blackmail, show pictures of the missiles and say that unless the West backed out of West Berlin, that was the testing place of freedom in those days, that then he would use the missiles. So we had to keep it secret.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
What is the best way to go about to pick those members of the team? Do you look for somebody with the same ideals as yourself?
No, not necessarily. Somebody who has judgment. That's the key. Judgment usually comes from experience. Of course, I was pretty young, but he had had enough years with me to still have some confidence in my judgment. Because he knew I looked at the world and the country the way he did. I thought through his mind and saw through his eyes. So he was willing to put me on his Cuban Missile Crisis team, even though I had no real foreign policy experience at all. And the same was true of his brother Bobby. And the same was true of others in that team who were not on the National Security Council, but whose judgment he wanted.
Did you feel that way about McNamara?
Yes, very much so. McNamara, has gotten a bad rap as being pro-war and being a cold fish. Neither one of those is true.
He didn't want a big group, so he was inviting me and Bobby and a couple of others who were not official statutory members of the National Security Council to come to that first meeting later that morning. He wanted everybody there face to face to come up with a decision. And later that morning, we had a meeting, and he told us that he wanted us to present to him every single option he had. Military options, diplomatic options, combined military, diplomatic. What were the pros? What were the cons? And that was the beginning of 13 long, difficult, dangerous days.
If there is a strike, I think we must assume we'll kill several hundred Soviet citizens. Having killed several hundred Soviet citizens, what kind of response does Khrushchev have open to him? A course of action where we strike without warning is like Pearl Harbor. It's the kind of conduct that one might expect of the Soviet Union. It is not conduct that one expects of the United States. If you go the blockade route, you can take more time. The question really is as to what action we take, which lessens the chances of a nuclear
not until the 22nd of October, 6.5 days later, that he was ready to go on national television and let the world know, let the Soviet Union know, let all our allies know exactly what the group that he had assembled around that table, about a dozen of us, what we had decided on, and what our decision was not the first automatic response, which was bomb those missile sites, get rid of them. No, that would have started a war. No, our decision, his decision, was to put the ball in Khrushchev's court, make him decide between annihilation for the world or possible humiliation for him. And that option, that's the second option that we chose, was in effect a blockade of destroyers around Cuba to keep out any further Russian shipments. We didn't call it a blockade because a blockade can be an act of war under international law also. We called it a quarantine against offensive weapons. He wasn't trying to keep medicine or food or gasoline or energy out of Cuba. He wasn't trying to punish the people of Cuba. He just wanted to make sure Khrushchev understood that we were determined to react and resist.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
You mentioned the quarantine, sir. Who was the person sitting around that table that brought that idea up? To me, it was a stroke of genius.
Well, thanks. I don't get any credit for it. I think there were two people who do. Interestingly enough, the head of the CIA at that time had been a businessman, and he'd been in the shipping business, and he said, if you put up a blockade, act of war, then under most insurance codes, any ship from Europe traveling across the Caribbean is going to have to pay 3 or 4 times as much insurance on that cargo as they usually do, and they won't be very happy about that. And then the legal advisor to the State Department remembered that before World War II, when Nazi Germany was threatening Western Europe, Franklin Roosevelt had proclaimed what he called a quarantine of the aggressor. Basically, it was an embargo, as I recall. I don't recall. I was a baby. But that quarantine was a peaceful act. And later on, the State Department was able to get all of Latin America, the Organization of American States, to join with us in adopting and endorsing that quarantine. And that made it a regional security arrangement, and regional security arrangements are permitted under the United Nations Charter, and Kennedy wanted to abide by international law. The group that wanted the quarantine asked me to give him a speech so he would see what the components were, what it would look like. And yes, I did put in that speech eventually all the arguments, all the components of the response, including talk about negotiations and recognition of the importance of peace, even an appeal to the people of Cuba to make clear that we were not trying to hurt them. And that did bring all the elements of everybody's thinking around the table together. But I want to stress that it was John F. Kennedy who brought us all together and led the way.
Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere. And we hope around the world, God willing, that goal will be achieved.
How did you come to write that speech?
Well, that was my job in those days. I was much more involved with Kennedy in terms terms of formulating his program, policy, messages, speeches than I was involved in foreign policy until he invited me to participate in the XCOM. So when the group favoring, as I did, the quarantine approach over the bombing approach, when they asked me to put a speech together, I went to my office, which wasn't that far away from the cabinet room, and I sat there staring at the blank paper and thinking to myself, well, what can I say? How's the quarantine going to get some of these are the same questions the Hawks were asking.
Mm-hmm.
How is the quarantine going to get rid of the missiles? How is the quarantine going to diminish the danger? And so on. And finally I went back to the Dove group, and I told them I had these questions, and we sat around the table and answered those questions. I went back to my office. By this time, it was late in the evening. I had to cancel a dinner date, and one of the grand dames of Washington, at whose home I was expected for dinner, when I told her, because nobody knew there was a crisis, I told her I couldn't explain what I was doing, but I just couldn't come for dinner that night. She was nice enough later to send her housekeeper over with a covered plate with a delicious dinner that fortified me through the night, and thank goodness, because I worked through the night on that speech. I took a look at Woodrow Wilson's declaration of war in World War I.
Could I just interrupt you for a second? Because sometimes I'm faced with decisions like that, not of that magnitude, but I want to know what you ate that night to give you that insight.
I have no recollection, but I remember that it was hot and very tasty.
And very tasty.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
A much more difficult draft under much greater pressure, and that was the draft letter to Khrushchev on Saturday, October 27, the ultimate day of the crisis. And that letter I like to think it had a part in persuading Khrushchev that he had made a reckless gamble, as he called it later, and he pulled his missiles out.
Can we talk about that letter then?
Absolutely. Go right ahead.
Okay. You had received conflicting letters from Khrushchev. The first letter you received was more or less him under great stress, and the CIA said written by himself. The second one looked like it had been not written by him, but by the Politburo. And that was
or
more
the military presidium.
Almost like...
You're absolutely right. That first letter came in Friday evening, October 26th, and yes, it was a bit emotional. It meandered all around. It was full of threats saying if the U.S. does anything, the Soviet Union will give us all that and more. In addition to threats, it was full of denials. We don't have any nuclear missiles. At Cuba, he said, we have some specialists, yes, but they're not offensive weapons, because we put them there for defensive reasons, and if we put them there for defensive reasons, that makes them defensive weapons. But mixed in among the threats and denials were some indications that he wanted to end this dangerous crisis. Also, some hints of a quid pro quo that might enable that to take place. That letter came in Friday night, and we were sitting around the cabinet table Saturday discussing how to answer it. We had at least two competing drafts in front of us, one from the State Department, one from our U.S. mission at the United Nations, and then a second letter, as you point out, came in. This one much stiffer in tone, and the message of that second letter was, we're not taking anything out of Cuba unless NATO, which Canada's a member, unless NATO takes its missiles out of Turkey. Now, we all knew that the NATO missiles in Turkey were insult and a particular bone in the throat of Khrushchev and all the people of the Soviet Union when they took vacations on the Black Sea on the Ukrainian side. They could look up from their fun at the beach and see those missiles in Turkey pointed toward them.
Hello?
Yes, please.
Oh, it's the general on there?
I'll put it on, yes, sir.
General, I just wanted to bring you up to date on this matter because I know of your concern about it. We got Friday night got a message from Khrushchev, which said that he would withdraw these missiles and technicians and so on, providing we did not plan to invade Cuba. We then got a message, a public one, the next morning, in which he said he would do that if we withdrew our missiles from Turkey. We then, as you know, issued a statement that we couldn't get into that deal.
Had Kennedy not ordered those missiles out of Turkey?
Yes, and he had been told the previous year that they were old, anachronistic, unreliable, and that what the United States really should do is move that portion of the regional deterrent into modern Polaris nuclear submarines under the Mediterranean. They were reliable, they were powerful, and best of all, nobody could see them, so they weren't provocative. But as things go in government bureaucracies, that order by Kennedy to remove them had never been fulfilled. So then we were faced with those two letters, how to answer them, what to do about the fact that the second letter was much tougher than the first.
Ted, was there a fear that perhaps a coup had taken place in Moscow?
There was concern that the military presidium had, in effect, overruled Khrushchev and put in this second letter with much tougher demands rather than anything in the first that hinted at a peaceful withdrawal. Finally, the wisest man around the table, other than the president, Ambassador Llewellyn Thompson, who had been our ambassador in Moscow previously, who knew Khrushchev, understood him, he said, let's ignore the second letter and answer the first letter. And Bobby Kennedy supported that, and I also did. In fact, I said there are some elements in that first letter that we can respond positively to, and the president said to me and Bobby, all right, you guys go draft it. And we went down to my office, which, as I say, was just a few steps down the hall, and sat there, and that was the most difficult letter I've ever had to write in my life. I knew if I wrote the wrong letter, if I antagonized Khrushchev, if he was upset with my our ignoring the second letter, who knows, he might just push a button and fire those missiles. In those days, the cabinet room in the White House was not a reinforced concrete bunker. Today, I'm told that it is. Those days it wasn't. We knew that all of us sitting around that table could be sitting there in our last day on Earth if we didn't solve this problem very, very quickly. So the pressure was on me, and it was made even more pressure by the president's brother sitting there staring over my shoulder at what I was trying to write.
Can you take us into your thought process? You know, words can sometimes have a double meaning if they've got to be translated into Russian. The connotation of those words.
This back-channel correspondence with Khrushchev had begun a year earlier, and Kennedy usually had me do first drafts of his letters to Khrushchev in that correspondence. Sitting there at that table, I remembered some advice from my high school debate teacher, Florence Jenkins, and she said sometimes you do better in a debate by trying to adopt or adapt part of your opponent's case. And so I sat there and I took two or three of those positive elements from Khrushchev's letter the night before, and I reworded them a little bit our way, and I would precede that by the phrase, as we understand your letter, you propose, and then a little later on, as we interpret your letter, you are proposing. And Khrushchev may have wondered, did I really propose that? Because I changed, for example, his positive elements could be described as A, B, C, and I reversed the order, making it C, B, A, to make sure that they did the things we wanted them to do before we did the things he wanted us to do. Maybe a little tricky, but it worked.
That's brilliant. Sir, when you submitted the letter, did you have any second thoughts and say, well, maybe I should have worded it this way, that way? What was that tension like, that apprehension, waiting for the response?
Well, first of all, I gave it to JFK, who approved it. He had me read it over the telephone to our UN ambassador, Adlai Stevenson. He approved it. It was circulated around the cabinet table to the other members of ExComm. They approved it. And then Bobby was sent off to present the letter to Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin to convey to his masters in the Kremlin. But before Bobby left, the president called a few of us, mostly it was the Dove group, into his office for a private meeting and left the others sitting out there or getting themselves some food or whatever. And he and Secretary of State gave Bobby instructions to accompany delivery of the letter with 2 oral messages. Number 1, time is short. We're making this letter in a positive way, agreeing more or less with Khrushchev's letter, so this should end it, and we better end it fast because you never know when the hawks will rise. President's in charge of government, but we don't want the hawks to take over and start bombing and invading by Tuesday. This is Saturday. The other message was we can't, in a matter of a few days, persuade NATO to, which acts by unanimous consent. We can't get that by Tuesday to pull out the missiles in Turkey. But because the President of the United States had previously decided to take those missiles out of Turkey, we're not going to do it at the point of a gun, or nobody will have any confidence in us after that. But Mr. Khrushchev, if it makes him feel better, can be assured that it will be done in a matter of months if we can just get this crisis finished. So Bobby went to Dobrynin with the letter and with those 2 messages, and I woke up the next morning and turned on my radio, and Khrushchev was taking the missiles out.
You knew General LeMay.
I met him.
You met him.
He sat around the table when I was present, at least on one occasion. But contrary to the movie 13 Days,
yes, sir,
the Joint Chiefs did not attend our daily ExComm meetings. Only the chairman of the Joint Chiefs did, Maxwell Taylor, and he was a scholar. He was a reasonable man. He was not as hard-headed or hawkish or eager to go to war as LeMay and some of the others on the Joint Chiefs.
In the movie 13 Days, General LeMay is kind of portrayed as an excessive hawk, to put it mildly. Do you think that's pretty good characterization?
Yes, I do. General LeMay thought we could win a nuclear war. He thought, well, if we have a nuclear war, we'll probably kill 300 million Russians, and they'll only kill 100 million Americans, so we win. The other Joint Chief, remember, was the Chief of Naval Operations, who wanted to take Kennedy's restrained, passive blockade and have those destroyers, which are in the ring around Cuba, go out and look for Russian ships and shoot them and board them. And when McNamara said that's not the way to do it, Admiral Anderson, his name, complained and went to the White House and made his case to Kennedy that that's what should be done. And that's how ambassadors to Portugal are made.
Was there a real thread of that fear running through the administration that perhaps a coup could take place in the United States?
There had been at that same time period a very good movie which was total fiction about U.S. Army takeover of the White House, based on a good book. It was a good movie, and we used to joke about the movie, whether it could happen here. It was no joke when the Joint Chiefs, before that first week was over, demanded a session with Kennedy. When the Joint Chiefs met with Kennedy, Curtis LeMay, a man who believed in nuclear war, because he thought even if we suffered hundreds of thousands or millions of deaths, the Russians would suffer even more. So that was Curtis LeMay. That's what he thought was victory in war. He lectured Kennedy on what he thought the quarantine, the combination of diplomacy and the blockade, was too weak a response, and the American people wouldn't like it. Can you imagine a military chief lecturing the President of the United States on what the American people think?
I think that a blockade and political talk would be considered by a lot of our friends and neutrals as being a pretty weak response to this, and I'm sure a lot of our own citizens would feel that way too. In other words, you're in a pretty bad fix, President. You're in a pretty bad fix. I don't share your view that if we knock off Cuba, they're going to knock off Berlin. If we don't do anything to Cuba, then they're going to push on Berlin, and push real hard, because they got us on the run. If we take military action against Cuba, what do you think their reprisal would be? I don't think they're going to make any reprisal. If we tell them that the Berlin situation is just like it's always been, if they make a move, we're going to fight. So I see no other solution. This is almost as bad as the appeasement of Munich. But I just don't see any other solution except direct military intervention right now.
When Kennedy finally left that meeting and went out into the hall, he ran into me and he was upset, and he said to me, bear in mind, this is just the Friday the 19th. He said to me, he pointed to that room and said they're all getting things in worse shape, and he said to me, you and Bobby have got to get this finished soon. But turned out that he left his tape recorder going when he left the room, and we have recorded for history, and what LeMay and the Marine Commandant, David Shoup, and some others had to say with Kennedy out of the room was pretty close to treasonous and blasting him. And I'm told that when Khrushchev finally pulled the missiles out of Cuba without the United States firing a shot, not only was Castro upset that he hadn't been consulted, but the Joint Chiefs were upset that they didn't have their chance for a war.
You pulled the rug right out from Jesus Christ. What the hell do you mean? He finally got around to the word escalation. If somebody can keep him from doing the goddamn thing piecemeal, that's our problem. You go in and frig around with a missile, you're screwed. You go in and frig around with a little else, you're screwed. That's right. You're screwed. Some goddamn thing, some way, you can say either do the son of a bitch and do it right, and quit frigging around.
Were there those opposed to the quarantine, those that were adamant in going into Cuba?
Yes, during that first week of debate and discussion around the cabinet table, there were those who said the quarantine won't accomplish anything. How about that get rid of the missiles? Those missiles are pointed at us. It's a threat. Got to get rid of them. And I still remember the sentence of one of those hawks, as they were later called. He said, Mr. President, you've got to go in there and take Cuba away from Castro. And there was a time before the 13 days ended when it began to look as though maybe they were right. The quarantine was proclaimed. The destroyers surrounded Cuba, but work on the missile sites continued. And then one of our U-2 overflight planes was shot down. And by the time on the 12th day, the Saturday, the 27th of October, it surely looked as though war was likely to come, and some of those hawks were saying, "I told you so."
As evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office, and I quote him, "Training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive, and that if it were otherwise," Mr. Gromyko went on, "the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance," unquote. That statement also was false.
Even Lyndon Johnson, who was vice president at the time, he slapped his hand down on the table and he said, "Well, I don't know." He said, "All I know is that when I was a young man walking along a dusty road in Texas, if a rattlesnake reared up his poisonous head, the only answer was to take a stick and chop its head off." A little cool in the room after he said that. But John F. Kennedy was a strong and beloved president, and I don't think there was ever a serious chance that the civilian control of the military, which is a fundamental principle of American government, I don't think there was a serious chance of that being overturned at that time.
Castro was pressing Khrushchev for a preemptive strike against the United States.
This is a two-part answer if you've got time.
Sure, sir.
First is that, believe it or not, participants in the Cuban Missile Crisis from the United States, Russia, Cuba, had reunions to meet and talk about the lessons of such a crisis and how to prevent it from ever coming close again. We had one of those in this country. We had at least one in Moscow. We had at least one in Cuba. And then we had another one in Cuba on the 40th anniversary of the crisis in 2002, and I attended, and Castro was there, as active as ever, not quite as healthy as the first time I met him, which was 1977. He invited the American delegation to lunch, and that was quite a friendly affair, a certain amount of banter and some toast. So I rose to give a toast. By that time, it had turned out that on that same Saturday, October 27, when we thought everything was dark and disastrous, Castro thought that it was too, and he called in the Soviet ambassador to Havana and dictated a letter to him that he wanted sent to Khrushchev, saying he, Castro, thought the Americans were about to attack, and he wanted Khrushchev to order those missiles fired and eliminate this scourge from the face of the earth. So at the lunch I rose to make a toast, and I chastised Castro for referring to us as the scourge of the earth and ordering us to be wiped out. Now that man needed an interpreter to speak to us, but he understood English. He heard what I was saying, and halfway through he interrupted me and said, "That's because I thought you were about to attack." I resumed my toast to say that, yes, I understood his motivation for sending that letter calling us such names, but in fact I was glad he had sent that letter, because that letter, even more important than the letter I had drafted, helped convince Khrushchev that he had made a mistake, that things were getting dangerously out of hand, because that very morning, early October 27th, 1962, his troops had shot down the American U-2 plane and pilot flying over Cuba. He had not authorized that, and the combination made him feel that everything was getting out of control. And so I said to Castro at that luncheon in 2002, I'm glad you sent that letter.
We all think of 9/11, but this was bigger, I think, in many respects.
Could have been bigger because we later found out that the additional Soviet troops that Khrushchev had put in Cuba to guard the missiles and otherwise had also been given authority to fire tactical nuclear weapons against any American attack, whether it came from air, sea, or land. And not only that, the authority to launch those nukes at us on their own. And had they launched nukes at us in those mad days, I say mad advisedly because of mutually assured destruction, MAD was the doctrine of the day, and had they fired nukes at us, we would have returned by firing nukes. Maybe tactical weapons came our way, we would have responded with tactical nukes. But once both countries are on that nuclear ladder of escalation, they keep going up the ladder, and then it would have responded with strategic weapons. We would have responded to that with strategic weapons, and so on up the ladder until both sides have emptied their arsenals and devastated every inch of the other country. And all those nuclear explosions in the atmosphere would have produced radioactive poisons that would have circled the planet by wind, by air, by water, by soil, until, scientists tell us, the whole planet was uninhabitable for plant life, animal life, or human life.
Ted, today's generation, for better or for worse, tends to get their history, if you will, from movies. I think of the movie JFK. I think of the movie 13 Days. I want to talk about the movie 13 Days. Do you feel that's an...
First of all, the movie JFK was total fiction, and I'm amazed how many young people today think it's history. On the other hand, the movie 13 Days, it had a few imaginative changes from history, which we can talk about. But essentially, it was accurate. It was based on the documents. It was based on a couple of long conversations that the producers and writers had with me. They conveyed pretty well the danger we were in and the very cool objective leadership provided by John F. Kennedy that steered our little group called the XCOM through those 13 days to a peaceful solution. I'm immodest enough to report to you that the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace had the courage to have a showing of that movie in Moscow. And they flew Bob McNamara and me and one of the producers of the movie over for that showing, a press conference after the screening. And Bob McNamara opened the press conference by saying to the producer, "It's a fine movie, but you have one fundamental flaw." And the producer swallowed. He said, "Well, I'm sure there are many. Which one did you have in mind?" And Bob McNamara, bless his heart, said it wasn't Kenny O'Donnell who brought us all together. It was Ted Sorensen.
Bear in mind that in the fall of 1960, Nixon came this close to being President of the United States. And 2 years later, in the fall of 1962, when the Cuban Missile Crisis was taking place and the Russians put those nuclear long-range missiles aimed at the United States 90 miles from our shore, Nixon was running for governor of California, and he was defeated. And you may recall, when he was defeated, he imploded at a press conference and said, "You're not going to have Nixon to kick around anymore."
That's right.
Imagine that kind of mentality in the White House when we were under that kind of pressure with those Joint Chiefs urging him to bomb. You and I are here today, in my opinion. The world is here today because Nixon lost that election.
I'll just tell you, the smartest man I've met in this White House is Sorensen. Told me tonight he just thought I was a big, fat, cigar-puffing, pot-bellied numbskull by following advice to get out here in front of the press.
What were your impressions of Mr. Johnson? Was he a good vice president? Was he a perfect choice? Was he the fellow to step in?
I'll say two things. Number one, I believe Kennedy would have retained him on the ticket for the second term.
Okay.
Number two, as my book makes clear, Kennedy, and especially Jackie, and to some extent me, the more we saw of him, the more flaws we discovered in him.
Okay. That's good.
That's enough.
Sorensen said we're the biggest damn fools he's ever dealt with.
Just a quick aside, did JFK have second thoughts about keeping Johnson on as vice president in the upcoming second term, 64?
No, because Kennedy by that time had proclaimed his support of civil rights and had sent to the Congress the most comprehensive civil rights legislative program since the days of slavery. And the South was against the program and against Kennedy, and Kennedy felt that he had to keep Johnson, his token Southerner, so to speak, his hand of friendship, his link to the South. So I think it would have been the same team.
I wish you'd talk to Sorensen about this before we do it.
What if you have a terrorist adversary?
All right, good example.
Yes, sir.
Khrushchev ultimately was agreeable to this exchange of correspondence and in effect, a negotiated compromise because he had a whole country, culture, civilization to protect. A man like Osama bin Laden, who operates out of a cave, doesn't have a country or a culture to protect. Deterrence requires the use of reason to somebody on the other side who thinks logically. A fanatic, whether ideological, religious, or other fanatic, isn't likely to think logically. He thinks, if I blow myself up and blow up 10 people on the other side with me, good, I'll go to paradise. Very tough to reason with that, very tough to get deterrence, containment, the policies that worked in those days, to work with that kind of thinking. My hope is that we will discover over time, if we don't blow ourselves up first, in Islam, as in Eastern Europe, there are moderates, there are modernists in their thinking. They can be approached. They should be encouraged. They may have to be protected. But reach out to them and start building some friends on the other side of that wall.
Back channel negotiations, if possible.
Exactly.
Reach out and try and find some.
Kennedy, as I think I mentioned in my book, asked his ambassador to India, Ken Galbraith, talk to the Indian High Command, which had good contacts with the North Vietnamese. See if they might be interested in some kind of standstill agreement. Neither one attacked or pushed the other out while they talked to see if there could be some compromise, negotiated agreement.
He was also trying very, very hard to do something with Castro.
Exactly.
Through back channel. And Castro was very receptive.
I think so. The Kennedy thought maybe Castro could become another Tito. Tito didn't have to end communism in Yugoslavia. He just had to break with the Kremlin and become an independent decision maker. Kennedy thought maybe Castro could become that way.
9/11. I want to touch on 9/11 right away. Your speculation on how President Kennedy would have handled 9/11.
Well, what you don't know about me, Brent, is that I had a stroke that year, back in 2001, and it pretty well eliminated my eyesight, which is why it took me a long time to write that book. Couldn't handwrite it anymore. I dictated it. I was in bed here at home at that time, and I heard about the first plane crashing into one of the Twin Towers, and I thought, that's a terrible, terrible accident. It happened once before, many years ago. A plane crashed into the Empire State Building. But when I heard about the second one, I knew it was no accident. That it was an act of terrorism, and that the United States was going to be a very different country if we started imitating what other countries under siege do, which is usually to crack down on civil liberties, crack down on free speech, crack down on immigration. And I regretted that. And George W. Bush made a speech which was, I suppose the speechwriters thought was called for, very nationalistic, chauvinistic, militaristic, vowing revenge, which a long time ago Thomas Jefferson said is the cheapest emotion there is. All the world was on our side after the attack on 9/11. Sympathy reports poured in. People at the United Nations and in the Western Alliance vowed that they would help in any way they could. But in less than a month, all of that disappeared, and in a matter of several months, the world had turned against us because President Bush, unlike President Kennedy, defied the United Nations. He defied international law. He ignored the alliance. He unilaterally invaded Iraq. At the same time, the United States went into war against Afghanistan. There was at least a logical justification for that. The Taliban running Afghanistan at the time had harbored and sheltered bin Laden and his al-Qaeda organization, in fact, given them positions in the security apparatus and police of the country where they tyrannized the local Afghan population who didn't like the Taliban, and they certainly didn't like al-Qaeda, but the United States bombed their homes and villages anyway, so the Afghan people turned against us too. No effort was made to find out whether there were moderate adherents to the Islamic faith, modernists in Islam who had a different belief, who did not support suicide bombing and all of that. Kennedy reached out to leaders in Poland and elsewhere behind the Iron Curtain, and in his correspondence with Khrushchev tried to encourage peaceful solutions.
Do you feel JFK would have handled it differently, more diplomatically?
I think he would have. I mean, after all, Islam is a distinguished classic religion. It has over 1 billion adherents in this planet, and I'm certain that Kennedy would have looked for a way to find someone with whom some understanding of a better world might be reached.
The Peace Corps gives us a chance to show a side of our country which is too often submerged. Our desire to live in peace, our desire to be of help. They are demonstrating their interest in people who may live on the other side of the globe, who may live in poverty and misery, but who, because of the presence of the Peace Corps, live in hope. There can be no greater service to our country, and no source of pride more real than to be a member of the Peace Corps of the United States. I hope that you will join.
Sir, if you were in charge right now, how would you deal with terrorism?
I would try to do all possible to regain the respect that the world had for the United States at the time John F. Kennedy was president. Nobody was threatening or attacking us then. People loved the president and they loved this country and its values. I think in Afghanistan we will achieve a solution there not by increasing the number of combat troops we have in the country, but by increasing the number of schools and medical clinics and libraries they have in the country so they can see the United States as it truly is.
To those new states whom we welcome to the ranks of the free, we pledge our word that one form of colonial control shall not have passed away merely to be replaced by a far more iron tyranny. To those people in the huts and villages of half the globe struggling to break the bonds of mass misery, we pledge our best efforts to help them help themselves. For whatever period is required, not because the communists may be doing it, not because we seek their votes, but because it is right. If a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich.
Did you ever have any aspirations, sir, to become president?
Not realistic ones, and I'm a realist.
Tell me the unrealistic ones.
No, having worked as closely with JFK as I did, having been involved in his policies and decisions as much as I was, I thought that if I were only more electable, which I'm not, that public office, high or low, might be satisfying. But I knew that that was not realistic. Nobody was going to give money or mount a major campaign among the cynical and conservative establishment types who run this country. Just as Kennedy knew that with his interest in foreign policy and peace and his determination to avoid a nuclear war, he couldn't do it as a one member of a 100-member United States Senate. He wanted to be able to do more. I wanted to be able to do more, particularly after I left the White House when I was nobody except doing some writing and lawyering. And I thought maybe I could run for office and do more. But I was not a very good candidate. Couldn't raise money. And
Does money play a big part? I mean, it does in Canada as well, don't get me wrong.
the play in the U.S. it plays a much larger role than it does in Canada.
Yeah. How do you feel about that then?
It's an outrage. It's legalized bribery. An office holder has power, influence, authority. A rich businessman has none of that, but he has money. And he wants to do something for his business, so there's a little quid pro quo. That's called bribery in any other country in the world.
What do you think is a better system?
Better system would be, number one, to have the television, which is owned, the airwaves are owned by the people, should be freely available to nominees of major parties, serious candidates. They wouldn't have to pay millions and millions for television presentations, whether it's the candidate himself or a commercial on his behalf or someone speaking on his behalf. The same could also be done with with mail campaigns. You take out the cost of television and the cost of mail campaigns and small donations from ordinary citizens. could finance a campaign for office. It wouldn't be the special interests with the big bucks.
When you know how to talk to government, you know how to talk to most governments. And pretty soon, almost all that I was doing involved foreign governments. The highlights were I represented Anwar Sadat at the time that he decided to go to Jerusalem. I represented, or at least I advised, Nelson Mandela when he came out of prison and ran for president of South Africa. Of all the foreign leaders I've met, and I've met dozens of them, he was the most impressive.
Was it his persona? Was there a charisma about him?
There was, but in addition to that, he had a calm, statesman-like, unselfish view that reminded me in many ways of JFK. When Nelson Mandela came to my law office for a meeting of a group I set up to contribute funding for voter education in South Africa, he held an impromptu press conference there after our board meeting was over, and the members of the press peppered him with questions about the fact that he and the South African white president at that time, who was one of those who had him in prison,
de Klerk,
that he, Mandela, and de Klerk were both sharing the Liberty Bell Prize they give in Philadelphia. And so just about the first question he got was a softball. How do you feel about the fact that de Klerk, part of the regime that kept you in prison for 27 years, is sharing in your prize? And I thought that was Mandela's opportunity to really blast de Klerk. But no, he said, well, that's a decision for the people of Philadelphia. For the time being, Mr. de Klerk and I need each other. After that period ends, we'll go our separate ways. That was a brilliant answer. And I had some involvements with a number of other countries, including helping draft a constitution for Tajikistan, one of the Central Asian republics that emerged when the Soviet Union collapsed. And, well, I could go on and on. I've had a lot of interesting assignments.
Do you feel at this juncture of your life that you could just be free to say whatever you want and damn the consequences? Or have you always felt that way?
No, not always. I didn't feel that way when I was in the White House. I was not speaking in public for the most part, and I certainly was not voicing any policy other than the president's. But since then, I've spoken out, and I still speak out quite freely.
I just want to mention the Kennedy team. He had put a dream team, to coin a popular phrase, together. Certainly, you had been with him for a while. Then he brings in McNamara and Bobby, his brother. There was others as well. There was Kenny O'Donnell, Dave Powers, etc., etc.
Just look at the history afterwards, which is that unlike most other American administrations, not one member of the Kennedy team was ever subsequently indicted for some kind of lobbying corruption. Not one member of that Kennedy team ever wrote a book attacking or criticizing Kennedy and his decisions. So it was a team of people who were dedicated to the best interests of a better country and a better world. They believed in Kennedy. He was loyal to them, and they were loyal to him. It was an unusual group of very able, committed people. I know that the song Camelot about mythical King Arthur is the song and the myth that was applied, but we weren't a mythical group. We were just ordinary flesh and blood human beings, but it was a very special time because we had a very special leader.
When you're writing at night, sir, what are your motivations? What are your ideas that you want to get across?
Number one, I want to keep the Kennedy legacy alive, what he stood for: social justice at home, peace around the world, decision-making that is solely in the interest of the nation and a better world. And I want to have a voice in all that.
Have you any aspirations to go back into politics in some sense?
No.
None at all. You don't.
No, and when the press asks me, I point out what Kennedy said in his inaugural address. The torch has been passed to a new generation.
To a new generation of Americans.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world.
You always downplay your role in the Kennedy administration.
Yes.
I think that's
the way it should be for assistants. Nobody elected me to office. Nobody asked me to lead the country nobody voted for my ideals and ideas and proposals and so on. So why should I try to minimize Kennedy's role by maximizing mine? That doesn't do me any good. Kennedy made possible everything that I've done and become. So I'm grateful and indebted to him for the rest of my life. I'm not going to diminish him and his importance.
I'm going to ask you a question now, just off the top of my head. Did JFK ever piss you off, sir? Did you ever disagree with him? Never.
No. He was a lot slower to lead on civil rights, which had been a subject very important to me when I was even younger. I was going to say when I was young, but I was pretty young when I was in the White House.
Yeah, you sure
But
were.
even
30s.
younger, I had started out talking about and rooting for civil rights, and he came from a totally different background and was a little slower. But my affection and admiration for him were such that I respected him always, admired him, and can never say that whatever minor disagreements we might have had on other subjects from time to time, that anything ever became a major block between us. In fact, just to take time for one other story, there was almost a lawsuit over the claim that I had been the author of his book, Profiles in Courage. He was very upset and angry about that. And when the lawyers for the other side, when he and his father were threatening the lawsuit, said, well, maybe Sorensen himself talked about writing Profiles in Courage. JFK said, no, he never would have said that. And the authors said, maybe he said it when he was drunk. No, he doesn't drink. Maybe he said it when he was angry at you. And JFK said, he's never been angry at me. And that was the truth.
There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin. Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. freedom is indivisible. And when one man is enslaved, all are not free. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
In my book, I point out the fact that after World War II ended, when it was time for draft registration, I registered as a conscientious objector.
Mm-hmm.
That was not a popular thing to do.
No, I understand.
Even today, I think probably people would, wrinkle up their noses and frown at that and make cast aspersions on my patriotism or whatever. But that's the way I felt.
Why would they do that to you, sir? Why would they do that? Why would they challenge your patriotism? You're virtually the fellow that saved the world with that letter to Khrushchev.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. I hope some people realize that. No, they think everybody is supposed to serve and risk his life for his country. I was willing to risk my life. I was willing to serve in the ambulance corps or whatever. I just didn't want to kill people. I didn't think it was necessary to kill people to save my country.
And Mr. Kennedy
I'm sure he knew about that.
And he respected that.
After all, he had to have an FBI check on me. And I'm sure they found that in my record. But obviously it did not make any difference to him, except when he had a meeting with the Joint Chiefs, he didn't take me into the meeting because he thought that might annoy them.
Is that right?
He didn't say that.
Yeah.
All I know is he didn't take me into those meetings.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
How was Mr. Kennedy as a father? He had two little ones running around.
He loved those two little ones running around the White House. Loved them, loved to watch them. Unfortunately, with his bad back, it was painful to pick them up, hold them up in the air, things like that. But he joshed with them and teased them. And anyway, he loved his men.
He did.
I give the credit more to Jackie than to him because they were still very little when he was gone.
Yeah, that's right.
But they turned out both to be wonderful young people, even though it was a time when growing up in the United States, tough for a lot of young people.
Can we talk about Jackie just for a few minutes?
A little bit.
Okay. Your fondest memories?
I was writing my first book, Kennedy, on Cape, in a home I'd rented on Cape Cod. She was still living in the family home. I would drop over and see her and the children once in a while, not often. I didn't want to intrude. She called me one day, and it was her birthday, and she had nobody. And she wanted to know if I would come to dinner. I said, of course. I had no opportunity to go shopping for an appropriate present. So one of my most precious papers among the papers I was reviewing for my book were JFK, the president, was a great, what's the word, doodler?
Yes.
And he doodled during the ex-con deliberations one day. And, it's historic. dangerous. IL-28, that's the bomb. Danger. And a lot of scribbling and so on. So I picked that up, and in an envelope I gave that to her because I thought it'd be worth something. And she loved that. And a few years later, she had it framed. Beautiful. And gave it to me as a present with beautiful words about my having given it to her, and she wanted me to have it for all I had done for her husband. And as you know, in the book, there's some very nice letters from Jackie, which I quote. I loved getting those letters. And I should tell you that I do mention in the book that one day she called me up and asked if her daughter Caroline, little girl who was supposed to write a paper about the Kennedy foreign policy.
This is a great story. Yes, sir.
And he wanted to know if she could send Caroline over to see me in my office. And I said, of course. And I gave Caroline a summary of JFK's foreign policy and his greatness and so on. And not so long ago, Caroline wanted her son to come talk to me about the same subject. His name is Jack. His name is Jack. And this summer he was an intern in the White House and divided the White House and in Senator John Kerry's office. My 11 years with Kennedy, I spent all the time with my kids that I could. I made sure I tucked my boys into bed at night when I got home. I was sure that when they got older, I would take time off from the office to go see their Little League baseball games. And I tried to have summer weekends with things let up at the office with them. But I didn't spend all the time with them that I wish I could have.
Yeah. They must be very proud of you.
Well, they are, and they all turned out to be wonderful young men. The 3 young men, and then that was a previous wife, and my wife today, and I have a wonderful daughter.
Congratulations.
She's teaching, she was a prosecutor, now she's teaching law at law school. Human rights, international human rights.
There's a riot outside because he wouldn't be safe. We couldn't consider moving Meredith. We haven't been able to restore order outside. That's the problem, Governor.
Well, I'll tell you what I'll do, Mr. President. I'll go up there myself.
Well, now, how long will it take you to get there?
And I'll get a microphone and tell them that you have agreed to be removed.
No, wait a minute. Wait a minute, Governor. Now, how long is it going to take you to get up there?
About an hour.
If you want to go up there, then you call me from up there, and then we'll decide what we're going to do. We got an hour to go, and we may not have an hour, but it won't take you an hour to get up there.
Why don't you give an order up there to remove me?
How can I remove him, Governor, when there's a riot in the street, and he may step out of that building and something happen to him? I can't remove him under those conditions. We've got to get somebody up there now to get order and stop the firing and the shooting. Then you and I will talk on the phone about Meredith.
1963, when we had not only civil rights legislation in front of the Congress.
That's right.
But we knew that coming soon would be civil rights confrontations at Southern universities.
The President's TV address to the nation after desegregation of the University of Alabama. From the President's office in the White House, June 11, 1963.
This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, and that the rights of every man are diminished
when the rights of one man are threatened. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all. Those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly are recognizing right. Thank you very much.
When Kennedy and Johnson put through a comprehensive civil rights program, they both agreed that that was the end of the Democratic Party in the South and maybe the end of the Democratic Party winning presidential elections. Since then, the only two Democrats who have won presidential elections up to before Obama were two Southern governors, Carter and Clinton, and every other presidential election was won by the Republicans with strong support from the southern and border states, and that anti-Democratic Party attitude continues to a considerable extent today, despite the miracle, and it was a miracle, of Obama's victory.
August 28th, 1963.
Yes, I remember very well.
Were you in the Oval Office that day, sir?
I was, yes. We were all working hard that day because that happens to be an extremely busy time of year in the White House.
What was your reaction to Mr. King's speech?
Oh, I happen to be an admirer of eloquence, and I thought it was one of the most eloquent speeches ever given.
Bobby and I started out as somewhat suspicious rivals for JFK's time and attention during his days as a senator and later as a candidate. But once Bobby became the 1960 campaign chairman, I think he recognized that I had some special values to his brother. He recognized that when he was Attorney General and I was in the White House with his brother.
Was there an outrage from the public or from his opposition when he brought Bobby in as Attorney General?
Yes, and I suppose if I were to look at it objectively today, I said it's probably not a good idea for any president, even John Kennedy, to appoint his own brother, even Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General. The Attorney General is supposed to be, under the Constitution, a check on presidential power. He's supposed to be an independent source of law and order in a country that believes in rule by law. And I suppose if any other president appointed his brother as Attorney General, there would be an outcry, and I'd probably be leading the outcry. We were lucky that Bobby Kennedy turned out to be as good an Attorney General as he was, and to play as strong a role as he did in bringing about and supporting the revolution in civil rights that JFK finally led after he'd been in office a couple of years. And after his brother's death, both Bobby and I recognized that for each of us it had been a shattering blow and treated each other accordingly. I wrote my first book, the book Kennedy, that you mentioned, on Cape Cod and off often saw Bobby, who would return there for weekends. And then when he ran for the Senate in New York, he asked me to go to New York and campaign for him, which I did. When he became a senator, he occasionally called on me for advice. I acted as lawyer for one of his books. And then when he ran for president, although I had advised against it, saying that 4 years later would be a much better time for him, he asked me to join his brother Ted and his brother-in-law Steve Smith in a triumvirate that pretty much was in charge of his presidential campaign. As far as his brother Ted goes, well, naturally, I've known him since my earliest days with John F. Kennedy, going back to 1953. That means I knew him for 56 years until the day he died. And during those 56 years, I was occasionally an advisor and always a friend.
Did Bobby's policies differ a lot from JFK's, or was he carrying the torch forward?
Initially, they differed quite a bit. Bobby was closer to their father, who was conservative and a little more militant, and Bobby worked for Joseph R. McCarthy when he first went to Washington. But Bobby, as Attorney General, was completely supportive of JFK's policies, particularly on civil rights, which was in Bobby's jurisdiction. And in the years after, Bobby continued as a United States Senator to forward JFK's policies on civil rights and on peace instead of constant resort to war and military force. And that's why Bobby would have found a way out of Vietnam, which JFK was on the verge of doing when he was killed.
What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another.
Can I touch on his death, sir?
Briefly, but it's the worst day of my life, so I don't like to talk about it too much.
Understood, sir. You wrote something quite ominous. Basically, upon reflection, you find it hard to believe now that perhaps some of Kennedy's enemies were not behind the assassination. Have I got that correct?
Well, something like that, because I don't know. Nobody really knows, and I try to avoid reading most of these so-called conspiracy books. The fact is that Kennedy had enemies in the right wing, particularly because of civil rights and because his American University speech indicated that he was taking a more accommodating position toward the Soviet Union. He also had enemies among organized crime, as did his brother Bobby. He also supposedly had enemies among communists in both the Soviet Union and Cuba, though I don't think either one of them would have thought that they would gain by Kennedy's removal. All I meant to say in the book was, considering the number of enemies that he had in the military and intelligence circles in the United States, Lord knows they had reasons to get rid of him. They had opportunities to have access to arms, to reach out to the kinds of weird and confused individuals who can be recruited for that kind of work. I don't make any accusations because I don't believe in making accusations without proof.
This country, as I said in the big forum, this country was changed in all kinds of harmful ways, both domestically and internationally, by the loss of John F. Kennedy. And without inviting a lot of new questions because I want to answer them. We're all going to learn more this year about why he was killed.
In my book, Consular, which is addressed primarily to university students anywhere in the world, that don't give up hope in democracy and freedom, don't give up hope in the fact that someone can overcome the kinds of hurdles that John F. Kennedy overcame in terms of his illness as a child and the handicap of his religion as a candidate, and even when the sky looked darkest when Soviets had nuclear missiles in Cuba, but because he worked hard, he focused that analytical brain of his on whatever problem he confronted. He didn't put any personal or political or other prejudice in front of what was best for a more peaceful, just world, and he prevailed, and so can any listener prevail if they will put their mind to it.
That's perfect. I want to thank you so much for joining us.
I enjoyed it.
Is there any leaders now, do you feel, that bring that to the forefront? Oh, that's a long hesitation, sir. I'll let it slide at that.
JFK and I, in 1956, when he first became a national figure and we were traveling to every state, we had been in Idaho, and we were flying from Idaho to Nevada in a little one-engine plane, and the local county chairman was the pilot. When the county chairman says he'll take you, you don't say no when you're trying to get a favor in Idaho. And as he flew started his descent into Reno, Nevada, the plane turned upside down. And I was sitting in the front with the pilot. I turned around, looked at JFK. He looked at me. It was a kind of a, my God, look. The pilot straightened out, the plane righted itself. He went past the airport, made a turn, came back, and he apologized, saying he'd been getting a little tired, and I don't know anything about flying airplanes, much less aerodynamics, but he said that you're supposed to come in against the wind, and he came in with the wind, and that's what caused that momentary shock.
Boy, that's a bit of a metaphor for what was to come.
Well, it might have, I think we'd already been through quite a bit together, and he knew more was to come, and it sure did.
Would you just tell that so I have it on camera?
Yes, actually, he had accepted the invitation to be the Democratic Party speaker for the Gridiron, the annual Washington Journalists Dinner where they poke fun at politics and politicians with an audience of big shot publishers, editors, and businessmen. And for weeks afterwards, he worried about, why did I accept that? You have to be funny. If you succeed, so what? Nobody cares if you're funny. They won't elect you president because you're funny. But if you fall on your face, if you fail, it's all over town that it's a disaster. So we worked hard. I tried to pull together all kinds of potential applicable humor. We even had a meeting with a couple of gridiron types to review some of the material. One of them tipped us off that the journalist's skit on the Democratic Party just before the speaker was a tune. The tune was "My Heart Belongs to Daddy," and because there had been so much nasty speculation that Kennedy's father was trying to buy him the presidency, the skit had John F. Kennedy singing to that tune, "Just send the bill to Daddy." Skit ends. John F. Kennedy walks to the microphone. Gentlemen, there are no ladies. Gentlemen of the gridiron, I've just received a telegram from my generous daddy. Dear Jack, don't buy one vote more than is necessary. I'm damned if I'm going to pay for a landslide. But it was a busy time.